Hey all, Grimrook here. It's finally time for a tutorial for my latest software release. Well, it's been a few months now, which is Soulstruct for Blender. I've spoken a lot about Soulstruct on this channel in my tutorials already. It's kind of a multi-armed thing at this point. It's an underlying giant Python library that handles reading and writing of From Software game formats, similar to the C# library Souls formats, maintained by TK. And it also contains a lot of utilities for manipulating data. On top of that, there's a GUI package, which is now in its own GitHub repo called Soulstruct GUI. That has been updated a lot since my last tutorial as well. A lot of those updates are quite experimental though, and kind of deep restructuring of my code, which has all happened kind of in parallel with Nightfall, because I kind of just add things to it as I need them for Nightfall. And I will do another tutorial for that sometime soon as well. And now we have Soulstruct for Blender, which you can find at GitHub under Soulstruct Blender, under my Grimrook name. And in the releases there, this is the latest release. I've just put it out minutes ago, 6 minutes ago, and it's the release I'm going to be using for this tutorial video. So go ahead and download the zip file here from releases. I recommend you do use the release. You can, if you want, clone the repo yourself. The add-on module is called IO Soulstruct. But the problem is it relies on other libraries, mainly Soulstruct itself and the Soulstruct Havoc experimental library for Havoc file reading, that are a bit harder to keep in sync with this add-on. So I do recommend you use the releases tab here, and latest is pretty reliably going to be the best, though that said, of course, I am still actively working on this. It's a very hot package, and so things may change, may accidentally break previous things and so on. If you do have any issues, feel free to report them here in the GitHub issues tab for the repo as well. I'll be using Blender 4.0, Blender 3.5 Plus is supported for the plugin. Now this is an unofficial add-on, which means we do have to kind of manually add it to our Blender scripts directory here. Assuming you're in Windows, if you go to your app data, so you can see this is under my user profile, app data, roaming, Blender Foundation, Blender, you will see subfolders for different versions of Blender installed on your machine or that have been installed at some point. This is 4.0. In here, as long as you've booted up Blender at least once, you should see this config, which saves stuff related to the kind of atmosphere of the program. We're going to create a new folder here called scripts. You may already see this. If you do, that's fine. Just head on into it. And then within scripts, we're going to create a folder called add-ons. And then we're going to go inside that. And inside this folder is where we're going to unzip the release of IO Soulstruct that we just downloaded. So once you unzip, you should see IO Soulstruct and IO Soulstruct lib here in the add-ons folder, which is inside scripts, which is inside the version of Blender you're using. IO Soulstruct is the plugin itself, so these are the various operators and all the code that is going to execute in Blender. And then IO Soulstruct lib is just a collection of the separate Python packages that Soulstruct for Blender needs to work. That includes Soulstruct itself and the Havoc extensions for Soulstruct, and also a few existing third-party Python packages that you might be familiar with. Okay, so with those files in the right place, if we now go to Blender Preferences, if we search Soulstruct in here, we can tick that. It took a second there, but as soon as we tick it, you see all of this extra goodness appearing in our 3D view straight away. Now, if you try to enable this and it doesn't do anything, chances are you just need to restart Blender. Just kind of the way Python works can be a little bit finicky sometimes with resetting the state. Now, I should say, if you're mainly using Blender for Soulstruct, I would recommend saving your startup file here. Otherwise, you will have to enable that every time you open Blender. You can see in File, Defaults, you can save the startup file. Now, what do we have going on over here? Well, we have 4 tabs in the 3D view, and this is indeed where you'll spend 99% of your time doing various Soulstruct related things. The General Settings tab appears in all 4 of these panels. It's exactly the same in all of them. That's just for convenience, because those, again, they're general settings, so you probably need to keep an eye on them no matter which of the tabs you're in. The tabs themselves are otherwise split up by file type, roughly. So we have FLVER files. These are the 3D models that define appearance only, so for the renderer. We have Havoc. This has 2 tabs for importing and exporting animations, which is one type of HKX file, and also Map Collisions, which is a completely different type of HKX file. We have the NavMesh tab for importing and exporting navmeshes. Now these only support Dark Souls 1 navmeshes. And finally, we have MSB. This kind of wraps the other 3 tabs, and it allows you to import map entries, so actual instances of these models and collisions and nav meshes, in a way that kind of imports some of their MSB data. So we're going to leave that for now though, because that's a bit more advanced usage, and we're just going to start off looking at the basic model editing workflow. Quick overview of the general settings. Some of these are more important than others, of course. We have our selected game. Now, Soulstruct will attempt to kind of read file formats as they come, even if they don't kind of match up the game you're looking at, but it won't always do that perfectly because there's a lot of spots to catch there. So I recommend you do have this set to whatever game you're working on at the time. We have our game directory. This is where the actual game executable is and a lot of the source files that we plan to use. So for me, you can see I've got a bunch of copies of Dark Souls Remastered in here. And as I pointed out in a previous tutorial video, my actual raw Dark Souls Remastered folder is just a link to one of these, whichever one I'm kind of working on at the time, so that I can use the Steam launcher for all of them. We're going to set it to Workbench here. And this is the folder we want to set. The executable is here, we just can't see it. So select game directory. Now your project is kind of a separate place where any files you export will be saved if you've specified it. It's completely optional. I've set it to this new folder I've just created called Test Blender DSR Proj in my documents. And what that kind of allows you to do is keep track of the files you've modded independently of the game installation, because chances are once you've done with your mod, you'll only want to distribute the files that are actually modified. And so the project folder will mimic the game structure, but someone who is downloading your project will be able to just copy and paste those files in and overwrite the files in their game folder. Quick note as always that Dark Souls Remastered is the only one of these games that comes naturally unpacked. If you're using any of these other games, you'll need the appropriate unpacker, probably from Nexus Mods or GitHub, to unpack them, and that includes Prepare to Die Edition. Otherwise, there won't be any loose files lying around for you to actually import. Import back file. If this is enabled, when you try to import a given file name, Soulstruct will actually check first if there is a .back version of that, which is the file created as a backup whenever you try to overwrite a file, if a backup doesn't already exist. We're going to keep that disabled for now. Prefer import from project. Now, because we have these two locations where files might be getting exported, we need to tell Soulstruct how to resolve the same file existing in both places when we're trying to import it. Say, I did work yesterday and I exported a modded version of Gwyn's model, for example. That model is now going to exist in the project and the game if I had also export to game ticked. If I didn't have that ticked though, the game one is still going to be vanilla. But if I want to keep working on the modded one, I of course, when I come back to work today, and because I'm a dum-dum, I forgot to save my blend file, so I'm just kind of starting from scratch here in Blender again. I want to import that modded Gwyn character from the project. On the other hand, if I decided that I don't like all that work I did yesterday, I could untick this, and now when I import character, it'll go looking for character files in the game rather than the project. Also, export to game means that when we export a file, it's not just going to go to the project, it's also going to get copied from there into the game folder so we can test it immediately. Chances are you'll want that ticked, if you want to test your changes out without going and copying and pasting in. If you don't define a project here, so if this is blank, you still need to have this ticked to have it exported to the game. Soulstruct will complain if you haven't specified a project or ticked this. That just means that there's nowhere to export to. Smart map version handling, I wouldn't worry about this too much. Basically, when the DLC came out for Dark Souls 1, FromSoft created a new version of map 12.0, which is Darkroot Garden and Darkroot Basin, that contains the DLC stuff, like the Manus portal. Now, all they actually updated there was the nav meshes, because they added a connection in the nav meshes to the sanctuary where you fight the Sanctuary Guardian. Now, if we actually look in our map directory, you can see these two versions of Darkroot here. It's the only map folder that ends in a 0.1 here. If you're looking in an unpacked Prepare to Die game, you'll notice that the 0.0 version has models and collisions, but doesn't have any nav meshes, whereas the 0.1 version only has nav meshes and nav mesh files like MCG and MCP. In Dark Souls Remastered, for whatever reason, they just kind of lazily copy-pasted everything from folder 0 into folder 1, and then they put the new nav meshes in there as well. At the end of the day though, what this means is that the game engine is only going to look in version 0 for map pieces, that is FLVERs, and collisions, HKX files, but it's always going to look in version 1 for navmesh files. To save you the pain of having to remember that, I added this option here that will automatically pick the right version of the map based on the file format you're importing or exporting. So if I'm working with map pieces, but I've got this set to 0.1, any map pieces I write to this folder are not actually going to be read by the game at all. And so what will happen here is that it will automatically export to version 0 instead. Vice versa for nav meshes, if I set this to 0, nav meshes in this folder don't do anything, so Soulstruct will automatically write them to version 0.1 and import them from there if if I went over to the nav mesh tab. The refresh file folder dropdowns button, hopefully you'll never have to click this. What it does is resolves any issues you might be having with the dropdowns here not refreshing when you set a new game directory, for example, or you've updated the directory on the disk, and you can click this to forcibly refresh these. Here we have the MTD BND path. MTD means material definition, and Soulstruct needs that to know what textures to expect and what textures to export for a given flavor that uses a certain MTD. You can find the name of a specific MTD in each flavor material, not just each flavor, but every material in the flavor, because they might have multiple materials, of course. And that is going to be the name of an MTD file inside this binder. This binder comes with the game, so as long as you've got a game directory in here, you don't actually have to put anything in here if you just want to use that game's MTD BND. On the other hand, if you're some kind of wizard who's creating their own material definitions and adding them to a new binder, then you'd want to put the path of that binder here, or if it's just not accessible through the game directory for whatever reason. So we can leave that blank here. PNG cache directory, on the other hand, we will almost certainly want to set. I've got this folder in my D drive called Blender PNG cache. This is for dumping textures that get imported from game DDS files, which is the format ready for game use. It takes a bit of time to convert those DDS files to PNGs so we can show them in Blender. By enabling write cached PNGs and then enabling read for next time, that'll speed up the process by checking to see if that image name already exists as a PNG in this directory. That's going to save you a lot of time, not just over a single Blender session, but over days, particularly if you're not actually modifying those textures. And so you don't want to waste time reconverting the same textures, a lot of which are common to a lot of flavors, of course, just like wood textures, grass textures, stone, and so on. I'm going to enable importing from project and exporting to game. And in practice, the setting you'll be changing most frequently here is the selected map. We're going to go back to File and Shrine here for our first example, which is M1002. And then let's take a look at our options for importing. Import any flavor does what it says. It doesn't make any presumptions about where you might want to import that flavor from. And it also supports reading from all the binder types that are known to contain flavors. So if I tried to import from a character BND here, it would look for a flavor inside there. If I went into the object folder, same thing for object BND. Each of those should have a flavor. And if I go into a map subdirectory like this, you can see these are all loose map piece flavors as well. In later games, you'll see these in map binders though. We're not going to use that though. We're going to use one of the shortcut importers here, which is going to automatically navigate us to the appropriate subdirectory in the game or project. For map piece, it's going to look at the map name we've selected here. So import map piece. You can see it's taken us directly to map/M1002. And if I change this to M11, which is the painted world, and I click import map piece, you can see now we're in M11. So just a more convenient way to get around there. Go back to FileLink. Character, on the other hand, this is not map dependent. It's just going to put us in the character file of our game. And again, once we export some of these to the character subdirectory in our project, because we have prefer import from project enabled, we would see ourselves placed in that subdirectory instead. So let's import a map piece, everyone's favorite starting map piece, M2000B2A10. If you haven't seen this before, the pattern for map piece names in Dark Souls 1, and pretty similar in other games, is the letter M for map piece, 4 unique characters that are always digits, but in practice they don't actually have to be. B2, because we're in block 2, that corresponds to the 2 in the second part of the map name here, and then A10, that's area 10, that corresponds to the number in the first section there. We have some options here. We do want to import textures. This is going to tell Soulstruct to go and look for map textures for this. The map textures in Dark Souls 1 are contained per area, so Soulstruct is going to go up to this M10 folder and it's going to look for textures in there, which we can't see in our browser here, of course. Alpha blend mode, this is the default mode we're going to use for alpha rendering for materials that we create. I recommend leaving this at hashed. Base edit bone length, this is just for visual purposes. It's the length of the blender bones that get created that correspond to flavor bones. Because flavor bones don't have a length. They only have a transform, like a position, a rotation, and a scale. So let's go ahead and import that. That only took 1.6 seconds. Now I'm going to try to avoid making this a general Blender usage tutorial. There are way better resources out there for that. But just in case this is your only reason to be using Blender, you can do basic things like middle mouse button to rotate around the selected object, zooming with the middle mouse, and a mode called Fly that I like to use a lot. If you've been using Dark Souls Map Studio, then you might be familiar with this mode where you hold right click there. If we enable this, then we can use WASD and the mouse to navigate around like we're playing the game itself. And you can actually even hit tab here to kind of get some clunky physics going, which I find very funny. Just like I'm playing the game, right? Yeah, whoop, off I go. Okay, so not looking particularly realistic right now. What we want to do is change our render mode to use material preview mode, and it'll take a second to load the textures there, and here we go. So looking much better now. This is the map piece as it looks in game. Apologies if you can hear my fans spinning up a little bit here. And you can see what's happened here is that Soulstruct has found the textures that this flavor is using by looking them up by name, and it's created Blender materials that mimic the appearance as closely as possible of the game's shaders. They're all pretty basic in this case. And we have UV unwrapping and everything as well. If we hit tab to go into edit mode, we can actually see the mesh itself, and this is of course is where we would do most of our changes, you know? So I can transform vertices. Let's turn on proportional editing, and we can make the old file link well here, nice and big. Alt Z is going to put us into transparent mode, which is going to let me select this. And of course, if we turn on the material here, we can see the kind of UV deformations that we're doing by doing things like that. But again, not a Blender tutorial. The idea is that once you've imported this, you can use all the tricks in the book in Blender to change this mesh however you want. Now, quick note about how flavor files are actually structured. If you've worked with them before, you might know this, but they're actually divided up into separate submeshes. And this is because they're really optimized for game rendering at the point that they're given to us, of course. They're not optimized for modeling anymore. And for years, my prototype Blender plugin that was unreleased was just importing these submeshes as different sub-objects, and I had to edit them all manually, which is really annoying because a lot of them share vertices. They'll just like abruptly start and end along certain edges. So one of the main things that Soulstruct does now is merge all those submeshes into a single mesh, and it handles all the duplicate vertices that might come along with that. Even just by importing this mesh and then re-exporting it, if I don't change anything, you're not going to get the exact mesh back out, because Soulstruct has its own method of splitting up this now merged Blender mesh into submeshes for flavor usage, based mainly on their material, but also any other mesh properties that differ. Let's take a look at some other flavor data up here. So we can see that the root object of this model is actually an armature. You see the little person icon here, and this is what holds the bones. Every flavor has at least one bone, but you'll often see that bone just be a single bone at the origin that has the same name as the model. And every vertex in the mesh, which you can see here, is just a child object of the armature. It has a modifier on it that rigs it up to this armature. Every vertex in this mesh needs to be weighted to at least one bone. In the case of most map pieces, that bone will just be that single origin bone, which you can see here. I'm not going to focus too much on bones today. That's going to be more relevant when we talk about animation files, really, in future videos. If we look at our materials here on the mesh, we can see that 17 materials have been imported. So these all used to be separate submeshes in the flavor file, and now they're all just materials used for different subsets of faces in this one merged mesh. And if I go into edit mode here, which I already am, and I go down to the material tab here, and I select that material, if I click select, it'll actually select all the vertices using that material. These material names would be pretty tricky to pass if I just left them as the Japanese names. So you'll see Soulstruct adds this suffix to the name that includes the index of the material, the name of the material definition, that MTD file that this material is using, and then just the name of the model. This is just in case we import any other flavors in the same workspace here that use the same named material. By having the model ID in it, we make sure they keep separate, because chances are, even if they have the same name, they will not be the same material at all. Okay, Soulstruct at no point will look for existing materials when you're importing a flavor. It will always create them from scratch. And if we did, say, re-import this exact same model again, you'd see duplicate names here with a little .001 suffix at the end, which Blender adds automatically, because every material and data block and object needs a unique name in Blender. When we export these names, everything after that first square bracket will be removed from the name, so it'll just go back to these Japanese names. Flavor files do have some other data in them that we need to represent in Blender. If we go to the main object properties here, we select the armature and we look in custom properties. I'm just going to collapse that transform for now. You can see these custom properties that Soulstruct has added to this object. This is a Blender feature. You can add any property names you want with different data types. These 8 properties are kind of the core flavor information. Good news is that they're all pretty generic, and within a certain game, as far as I'm aware, you'll actually never even see them change. You know, only old console files, Big Endian for example, all Dark Souls flavors will use Unicode strings. These are all going to be false or 0, these unknowns, and the version is going to be Dark Souls A. Now, say we made our own flavor completely from scratch. It's a bit of a headache adding all these custom properties, especially when they're just going to be generic default values anyway. Good news is you don't have to add them. Soulstruct will write these default values automatically just by sensing the game that we've chosen here. The mesh does not have any custom properties. Everything in there is on the materials. So if we select a material, go to the material tab here and look at its custom properties, you can see there's a few more things that the material is defining. Now, a lot of this information is pretty junk. The default bone index, for example, you can see this flavor only has one bone, but this default bone index is all over the place. We also have a face set count. This, some flavors use multiple sets of faces to represent lower resolution LOD versions of the model. Can't actually export them from Blender right now, so you might see this being set anywhere between 1 and 3, but when you export, basically it's going to use 1. And what that means is that you're not going to get any of those LODs in the old. But fortunately, these game engines are so old relative to modern computers at this point that it probably won't cause you any issues. Flags, I'll be honest, I have no idea what they mean. They vary all over the place for different materials. Is bind pose? What that means is that the vertices in this material are kind of properly rigged to the bones they're weighted to. You'll basically see this always disabled for map pieces and always enabled for rigged flavors like characters and objects and equipment. And Soulstruct will actually handle bones differently depending on whether this is enabled. For map pieces, the bones are just used to offset the vertices they're weighted to, and each vertex can only be weighted to one bone. For characters and objects that have isBindPose enabled, the bone data will be written just to the edit bones, so kind of in that default character T-pose, ready to be deformed with animations. Again, not something you'll probably need to worry about in standard practice. Now here's that material definition path I mentioned. You can see it's the full kind of unpacked game path, but what matters most is the file name right at the end here, and we can see that's the same material name that's been added automatically to the materials, just for your quick inspection. In fact, this map piece only uses 2 different very generic materials. We have MDB, which is diffuse and normal, and we have some of them with this extra M suffix, which means they use multiple textures, 2 textures that are blended together. Finally, we have this unknown, which I think is always 0 in Dark Souls 1, so don't worry about that either. And remember I mentioned that every vertex in a flavor needs to be weighted to at least 1 bone. We can see that here in our vertex groups. And if we go over to the mesh data here, you can see that same information here. And again, if we go into edit mode, deselect and click select, you can see that's just every vertex in the model. We'll see for character model, there's going to be a lot more of these, 1 per bone that's actually used for rigging, and we can use the select and deselect here to control that. If you export and you get an error about a vertex not having a bone, chances are you're going to come and want to look at this. You're going to need to create a vertex group with the same name as a bone to weight to, and then select the vertices and assign them to that group. The other thing for map pieces, again, they can only be weighted to 1 bone, whereas character and object models can be weighted up to 4 bones per vertex. Now, the final thing we're going to look at for just how the flavor is represented in Blender is over here in the shading workspace. We've already entered preview mode here. I'm going to zoom over here and take a look at this. And down here, we have the shader node tree laid out to see. So this entire node tree has been generated by Soulstruct, and this is code that I've got going on to faithfully recreate as many materials as possible. The only key part of information in here is in these orange texture nodes, because these contain the textures which have actually been loaded, and the names of those textures we need to export back to our flavor file. The texture data itself is completely optional. Remember, these are already packed into the map textures, in this case for map pieces. But these image names will be used, and the PNG suffix will be fixed when we export. The labels of these nodes are the names of the samplers that the shader is looking for. So these, you can think of these as texture slots, or texture types. This is one of those multi-texture materials. You can see MDBM. And in fact, why don't we go into edit mode and look in our material tab here so we can see exactly what we're working with. Just by selecting different materials, you can see all the different node trees, different texture names. I'll kind of let you inspect the shader tree. What I can tell you off the bat is that we have a diffuse texture being plugged into base color for the shader. The specular channels are being split up into red, green, and blue. We invert the red and green textures and we plug them into specular IOR and roughness, and the blue texture gets plugged into transmission. You'll only see the blue channel in the specular textures really used for crystals and glass and things like that. This is all specific to Dark Souls 1, by the way. Later games can and do this a bit differently, including different texture type names and different ways of handling the texture data and so on. Finally, we have a bump map, which you can see over here. It uses the red and green channels as vector information for a normal map to create that look of displacement that's very cheap to render without actually deforming any geometry. That's passed through this normal map node and plugged directly into the normal input of the BSDF. Over on the left here, we have the FLVER's UV data, which is added to this UV map we've created called UV Texture 0. This material only uses one texture. In fact, when we select where it's being used, okay, it's all the brick going on here, so this is pretty basic material. Why don't we go and look at a multi-texture material? So just select that, see what we're working with. Okay, so just by looking at the FLVER, we can see that it's blending grass and these kind of cobblestones together. If we go look at the shader, we can see that. So we have three textures that are the diffuse, specular, and bump maps for the cobblestone. And then down below that, we have extra slots with an _2 after them, with the grass, diffuse, specular, and bump map as well. And we have UV layer, UV texture 1 being plugged into those, because this part of the mesh actually uses 2 UV layers. Each of these groups of textures has its own BSDF node, and right at the end here, we have a mix shader that is mixing those together to produce this blended look. The weighting for that blending is actually coming from the vertex color data layer. It's just another piece of data that's attached to vertices, and the alpha of that is being plugged into the factor here to determine the mixing. If we just unplug that and drag this around manually, you can see exactly what happens, right? When we go from 0 means we're weighted at the first set of textures, which is cobblestone, and then grass if we weight towards 1. So let's pop that back in. The vertex color alpha is controlling how the game does that. And that's the entire FLVER file in a nutshell, really. Enough mucking around though, let's make a little edit here. I messed around with the well before, and I think I'm gonna do that again. Now remember, we're editing a FLVER file. This is a visual model only. This is not going to affect the collision, not yet at least. You know, that's a whole different file format. Let's go to the modeling tab. You know, I like to make use of Blender's workspaces here, just kind of sets everything up in a nice way. And I'm going to click on that vertex and I'm going to press L to select all linked vertices. And now if I drag this around, you can see that indeed the only vertices linked to that one I selected are the well itself. And now I can just, when I turn on material while I do this, I'm just going to scale that well up. And I'm going to press 2 so I know I'm scaling it to exactly 2. So we get a giant well. How do we export? Not particularly hard. By the way, if you can't see your plugin tabs over here, just press the N key or click the little arrow in the top right and you can open and close those. Go to Soulstruct FLVER, FLVER export. We're going to leave this at 0.2 just like we did on import. The most important thing is that it's the same for import and export, or we're going to get weird bone scaling. We have options here for how we want Soulstruct to respond to either missing textures that it's expecting in that shader tree, or finding textures that it doesn't know what to do with. So if we tick this, that's going to mean that if we forget to specify, say, the diffuse texture, so the node is there in the shader, but there's no texture, then an empty name will be exported to the FLVER. And what that means is that you're not going to see any diffuse texture. On the other hand, if you think you know better than Soulstruct, which is entirely possible, if I've missed a certain type of texture that you know this FLVER needs, then you can create that node yourself, give it the right name, and then enable allow unknown texture types, and they'll be forcibly exported to the FLVER file. So we have export loose FLVER. If you just want to write a FLVER file somewhere for whatever purpose that you've come up with, you'd use that. If you want to put the FLVER into an existing binder, you'd use this one and you'd navigate to the binder file. The FLVER will replace whatever FLVER already exists in that binder though. But we're going to use these export to project game utilities. We're going to take full advantage of our folders that we've set up there. And there's a couple more settings to consider here. First of all, detect map from collection. This is mostly for when you're using MSB import-export mode, but chances are you'll want to organize all the models you're importing, especially with maps, into Blender collections, so you can easily toggle them and so on. If this is enabled, it will look at the name of that collection and try to find the map automatically. Otherwise, it's going to use this map. So if I'm looking to export this to Filing Shrine, but I've accidentally changed this to another map and I've forgotten about it, This would allow the collection to override this setting, and it would presumably still go into M1002. If I disable this, which I have to here because I don't have one of those collections, then it's going to export this to map 11 as it is right now, and that's not going to do a whole lot because that map won't even be looking for this model name. So let's make sure to set this back. We have export textures here. This is only possible when you're exporting to the project or the game because the textures go in varying places depending on the file type. By the way, I'm rambling on a lot here, but you can just hover over these and read doc strings that I've set up as well. This is a very expensive operation because all of these PNG files in Blender need to be converted back to DDS, which is very time consuming and tricky. And for that reason, it has its whole extra tab of settings down here that we're not going to get into today. The DDS format for each type of texture, the number of bitmaps, other options, etc. We're not going to touch that right now though. That's a whole future video thing. And chances are you probably don't mind about using existing textures anyway. Or of course you can just manually do a texture replacement yourself. Create LOD face sets. Now we saw in the materials that there was this face set count setting. If this is disabled, which I recommend for Dark Souls 1 at least, it's only ever going to write one face set. That's because it's really tricky to create those LODs in Blender because the different face sets are lower poly, but they have to use the same vertices. So we can't just decimate the mesh in Blender here. We need to do something a bit smarter. I'm not smart enough to have set that up yet, so we just don't do it. And that's kind of a big bottleneck for exporting flavors from newer games right now. Now we have this value for normal tangent dot max. Here's the lowdown on that. If we exported everything raw as is right now, when we're splitting this big merged mesh into the different submeshes, we have to decide when one vertex is identical to another. And the reason that matters is that, of course, each vertex appears in multiple faces. So all these 6 faces right here all use this one central vertex. What we could do, if we were just going to be completely brute force over the top with it, is write 6 copies of this vertex. These are called loops or face corners, one for each face using it. And then the normal for each face's copy of that vertex would be appropriate to the face. Now that's a huge waste of space. You're going to generate these enormous meshes that the game won't even be able to load because there is a maximum number of vertices in Dark Souls 1 that a mesh can have. So of course, what we really want is these 6 faces to use the same vertex in 99% of cases. Now the reason you might not want to do that is A, the vertex has a different UV coordinate, and you can see that's actually going to be the case here. You can see that there's a texture discontinuity, and if we go into the materials here, you can actually see that these 3 faces are using material 8, and these lower ones are using material 16. So in this case, we actually do want to duplicate this vertex. One copy for these 3 faces, where it's going to have one UV coordinate, and one copy for these 3 lower faces on a different material. And in fact, because they're in different materials, even if the UV was the same, they're always going to be split up anyway, because we assume each material here is corresponding to a submesh that we want. Now that's one case. The other case where we need to decide if we want to split or merge a vertex is related to their normals. And this is really only an issue on very sharp edges. There's no real good example here, but you can imagine like a sword in a character model. The normals on each side of that sword are going to be almost opposite, like 180 degrees rotated. And so we want to duplicate the vertices along those faces to ensure that their normals do not try to average out this sharp edge of that sword. The question we're left with there, of course, is what is the rule for when we consider the normals of 2 adjacent faces to be similar or different enough to merge or split? And that's basically all this value is. 0.999, that's the dot product we're going to be looking at for the 2 vectors, and it corresponds to about 2.56 degrees difference. So if 2 normals are within 2.56 degrees difference, when Blender tries to export them, they will be merged. Now that's probably more detail than you wanted to know, but what I'm telling you is that you can try playing around with this parameter if you see some wacky behavior, particularly along the sharp edges of your models. Okay, and if you set it to 1, that means that the normals will only be merged if they're exactly identical. That's really going to inflate the size of your flavor file, but it will guarantee that, the slightest difference in normal does cause that vertex to be duplicated for the faces that use it. And that's it. So after all that, we're not really going to change any of these. What we're going to do is select our armature. Now when we're exporting here, you can export in edit mode, that's fine. You can select the mesh or you can select the armature. Soulstruct will find, both, no matter which one you've selected. And we're going to click export map pieces. Just before we do that, notice that these other ones are grayed out right now because character models are expected to start with C and object models are expected to start with O, whereas ours starts with M, and that's what export map pieces is looking for. So let's go ahead and click that. Before we do that as well, I'm just going to turn on the console. If you're on Windows 11, you might have seen this by default already, but this will report useful information, including if anything goes wrong. So let's go ahead and click and then look at our thing, and we're already done. So you can see created FLVER material. Console's really struggling with those Japanese characters there, but that's fine. You can see the longest step, of course, was splitting the mesh into 17 submeshes, and that number tells us that indeed it is one per material that we had here. And because we enabled also export to game, you can see the last line is copied exported FLVER file to game directory, and we can confirm the path of that. It's in my workbench version of Dark Souls Remastered here. And because this is the first time that we've done that, it's also created a backup of that file in the game directory before we overwrote it. Let's boot up Filing Shrine. In debug mode, turn around, and lo and behold, it's a giant well. Now, like I said, the collision here hasn't changed, so we can completely walk inside it, and we're running into the collision of the old well. We haven't moved to this treasure corpse at all either, so no problem there. But yeah, everything else looks good. Let's hide our map piece and do a little quick character edit as well. Don't want to use the rat. I always do the rat. Let's go with the Black Knight. I'm going to use 2790. That's the Black Knight kind of multi-weapon variant. You can see the file size is larger than these other Black Knight variants. And that's because this model has all the weapons on at once, which is actually going to be a useful way to show how the game toggles between those different models. So again, all these materials and stuff we can see, less materials this time. What I want to point out here is these numbered materials at the bottom that have this very specific name format, hash, digit, digit, hash. That is a masked model variant, which means these parts of the model, you know, we can select them in edit mode, you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the long sword. Number 1 here is the great sword. Number 2 is going to be the axe. And of course, number 4, therefore, must be everyone's favorite weapon, the halberd. So because they have these names, the NPC param for whatever character is using this model will need to activate those mask indices in order to show that particular weapon. And this works the same way with the holo model that has different weapon options like the broken sword or the normal sword or the bow and so on. And because the Black Knight is an armor set you can obtain, you can see the names of the materials for that are actually going to be the same as the equipment flavors, which we're not going to look at today just because this video is already going to be way too long, but just worth looking at. So we know 9490 is going to be the ID for the Black Knight armor set. We also have our first duplicate material here as well, where we have this material name. The name part at the start is the same, but there's an extra suffix here. And what's happened here is that this corresponds to 2 different submeshes that were using the same material, except they differed in some way that we need to represent in Blender with a separate material. And the letters BC here tell us what that difference is. It is back face culling. So down here in the settings for the material, you can see the first one has back face culling disabled. So that mesh is going to render from both sides when you're looking at it. Whereas this version has back face culling enabled, so only the front sides of that mesh, the direction the normals are pointing, is going to render. Anyway, small difference, but worth noting. This might be a setting, chances are this is a setting you're going to want to play around with at some point when you're editing models and materials. There's a lot more bone action going on in this character model, of course, because there are actual bones to animate here, and you can see all those bones in the armature, these little kind of square cone shaped things. I should probably know the name for that shape, but I don't. These are 0.2 length, by the way, which is that setting that we had the ability to change when we were importing the model. And the rotation of these bones is very important, just like the position. And in a future episode, when we look at animations, we'll see how the animations are controlling these bones. The hierarchy of these bones is completely correct, you know, corresponding to the FLVER file. And we have a bunch of unused bones that aren't even part of the hierarchy as well. You'll see a lot of nub bones in Dark Souls 1, as well as these kind of dummy poly bones. If you look under the armature at these other children, you can see all these empty dummy objects. And these are just points on the model, just for arbitrary use by the game. The number in square brackets at the end is the ID of that dummy. The number in the triangle brackets is just the index for making sure the name is unique. And you'll see things like dummy 1, no matter what model you're looking at, dummy 1 is going to be with the right hand, dummy 2 is going to be at the left hand, and so on. You just kind of learn those conventions. as you do a lot of modding. And so when we're talking about making hitboxes or generating sounds from the character or visual effects, chances are it's going to use one of these dummies to create them. And you'll often see this dummy 200, which has a lot of different locations. So I don't remember exactly what uses this. I'm sure Meow Maridus knows, but you can see they're kind of peppered all over the surface of the model here as well. Keep that in mind when you're creating new characters. You kind of want to mimic whatever's going on with other characters in that game as closely as possible. These dummies are weighted to bones as well. So if you click on the dummy and you go to object and look at relations, you can see that they're going to be parented to a bone because, of course, we want the dummies to be animated during movement, just like we want the mesh, the weighted mesh, to be animated as well. And down in custom properties for each dummy, you can see a bunch of other settings as well that mostly aren't used. Parent bone name is just like a category, the bone that kind of corresponds to all those. It'll usually either be model dummy, or for the number 200 here, you can see it's SFX dummy. Anyway, back to the more exciting stuff. We're going to play around. I'm going to have some fun here with this Black Knight. I'm going to go to materials, which is just the most handy way of selecting a particular set of vertices. I'm going to go to this material, which we already looked at. This is the sword material, the long sword. And I'm just going to scale that bad boy up. All right, and you can see it's scaling relative to the center of my selection, which is typically what you want. Let's make it 5 times as big. All right, perfect. It's the perfect mod. Okay, tab out of that. Oh, nice big blood stains there. Bit scarier now, and why not? Let's do the shield as well. So I'll find that shield material, select, and let's make that twice as big. All right. And that's it. We are good to export, just like we did with the map piece. We're just going to use the export character option. It's going to do a bunch of things. It's a bit more complicated than the map piece because the character flavor is inside that character binder, the CHRBND file. But the exporter is going to find that binder and replace the flavor inside of it. And because we're exporting to the project as well, what it's going to do is, because that binder doesn't exist yet and it does contain other information that we need to kind of get from the vanilla binder, it's going to copy the game character binder to the project, then modify it, and then because we're also exporting to game, that'll be copied back to the game directory. Note that this plugin cannot create character binders or object binders for that matter from scratch. Okay, we've got our armature selected. Let's export character. Check the path down here. I can see it's copied to workbench character and looked like the right character binder name to me. And I happen to know that a Black Knight with this model ID and using the longsword variant is the first one you encounter here in the kiln. Let's go and see if I was right. I like what I see off the bat here. Very foreboding opponent. Yeah. That's it. I couldn't even tell what I was looking at from a distance, honestly. Okay, so I've got, I'm in debug mode here. I've got silent and hide on. There we go. Now you can see me. Oh yeah. Now, just like with the map piece, with the collision, we have not modified the hitboxes of this weapon at all, or the Knight's collision. So this is purely a visual edit. The game, as far as the physics engine is concerned and the combat engine, is not going to let us get hit by that sword, all the way out here, for example. Okay, now I do want to show you one more thing. I know I've focused a lot on flavors here, but I'm aware, just like I've shown you with the that unless you can modify map collision as well, your ability to make and edit maps is really going to be limited. Now, nav mesh is very important as well, but at least that's the kind of thing that you only really notice if, you actually have enemies running around or you're doing a lot of big map edits. So why don't we quickly, and I mean quickly, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, make a corresponding edit to the collision that we made with the visuals. So I'll disable that. We're going to jump over to the Soulstruct Havoc tab. The good news here is that even though the HKX files are way more complicated to read and write than the FLVER files, which is why one of the reasons this plugin has taken so long and why only Dark Souls 1 is really supported here right now, because I can actually read these map collision files. The good news is that in Blender, unlike all the FLVER bones and weighted materials and everything, they're actually quite simple. They're literally just a mesh, and the plugin does all the work creating all the surrounding Havoc settings that get exported with that mesh. Now, this is the generic importer. We could click this and just go looking for the collision that we want to modify, but instead we're going to use this drop down, Because the HKX files are inside a binder, unlike the loose map files or the single flavor character binders, we use this dropdown, and what happens is when you click this, Blender is going to open the HKX binder for that map, which is still selected on file link here, and it's going to display all the options inside that binder right here. So these are all the collision models laid out just like we were looking at all those loose map piece files a moment ago. This is going to be collision 0. Note that the IDs here basically never overlap with the map piece IDs. These IDs are actually more meaningful. They correspond to the display group that each collision uses. So you'll rarely see them go above 128 because that's the limit on the number of display groups in Dark Souls 1. And then you'll see all these special higher numbered ones that are like kill planes and slope collision and water and things like that. Okay, so having selected that, this little button lights up, which we can click. This option here, merge submeshes, is kind of a point of development right now. I'm going to leave it off, which is the default. And what that's going to do is every collision submesh is going to be imported as a separate mesh. But when we click this, we are getting an error that says it can't find this binder inside the project. So there we go, a little bug report here. I'm going to report to myself, but because we've got prefer import from project enabled, this particular operator is not handling the case where the game doesn't have that at all. So I'm just going to untick import from project, and now it's going to find it in the game one. Way down here, if we turn on our map again, we can see that overlaps nicely. But this collision doesn't actually cover the part with the well. This is another lesson to learn where the kind of space that map pieces and collisions take up is not always one-to-one. So from memory, we should be able to find it in number 1. Nope, that was down below. Surely number 2, surely number 2. Okay, there we go, number 2. Now, we can see a lot of flickering happening here. That's because we actually have a lot of meshes exactly overlapping each other, even without that map piece. What's going on here is that each collision has high-res and low-res submeshes, and these are actually found in separate files. You'll note here, if we just go look at the directory, you can see that there's a H binder and an L binder. Every collision ID appears in both, just it has a H prefix in the H one and an L prefix in the second one. And the L ones are low res, but unlike LODs, they are actually critical for the game to load them. So one of the annoying things about collisions is that you do have to kind of edit them at the same time. So let's go look at the well. These collisions are using very basic materials that I've set up. So if we jump over to the shading tab again and we select, if we look at the node tree here, you can see it's just a simple diffuse color, really nothing special going on, but the name of the material tells us a bit more. All these materials will start with HKX. Then we have the index. This is not the index of the material in the file. It's an actual meaningful index that corresponds to a game-defined Havoc material. I've mapped out a few of those. I know that material 1 is generally used as rock or stone, like kind of a hard surface. That determines your footstep sounds and the sounds that weapons make when they hit it, and so on. And there's also in brackets just indicating whether it's low or high res as well. So, you know, if I click over to this one and choose one of these green, you can see that's using material 3, which corresponds to grass. I haven't mapped out all of these, so sometimes you might see unknown materials appear in white, but a few of them are mapped out. I know some of my color choices aren't great, but it's pretty hard to find separate colors for stone and wood, because then I've got nav mesh color to consider as well, etc, etc. I've also darkened the low res versions, so you can see when we're on low res wood, which is material 4, it's a bit of a darker yellow. On this one, you can see the high res is a bit brighter. So if I move that just over here, for example, you can see that, though I don't actually want to do that. So yeah, make sure your high and low res collisions are overlapping. Now what you can do actually is literally just work on the high res and then copy it to low res if you're being really lazy, because the game engine is so old and easygoing now that even these high res collisions are considered very low resolution by today's standards. If you go look at Elden Ring or something like that. You can see some of these faces are actually not merged with the vertices around them. This is the way they actually are in the Havoc file. You know, it defines faces and it's defining duplicated vertices. Anyway, what that means is that it's much harder to select by linked. It's kind of annoying. You can see that all of these faces are actually just kind of detached from each other. And from memory, I scaled this to double. So I'm just going to hit 2 again and do that. That was the high res. So I'll toggle that off, put on the low res equivalent. A lot easier this time because the ground around this low res version is in a separate submesh. So not as much trouble. You can just just double that size as well. And if we go turn on this one, you can see I haven't had to touch this pink, which is colored pink because it is a material I only know as low-res ground, which is a ground alternative that only appears in the low-res meshes. And you can see if I look in here, actually, this ring needs to really be scaled up as well. So I'm just going to select that and do the same thing to keep that ring inside the mesh here. I think that'll do. We've edited the high and low-res submeshes for that. I'll just turn them all back on, select the parent empty object here, and then hit N, go to the Havoc tab again, collisions, and export, and you can see, now in this case, the collision importer has actually created a collection automatically for this map. And that means we can detect map from collection parent, then we don't have to worry about accidentally changing this because we were importing other stuff, etc. So let's go ahead and click that, export collision. Again, looks promising. I see the last output was the entire binder being copied to the game. Of course, that's necessary because the binder is one file on disk. Now, if we jump back in here, and of course, we're not editing params, so we don't have to restart the game every time we change something. And we are pushing against something, and we are hitting something. And I'm just gonna debug my way to stand on top of this well. The collision does actually look slightly off. Yeah, it's not perfect in the sense that, well, we can actually find out. So if we go back here, did I make a mistake in my well size? I definitely did. It's nowhere near as... Oh, I see what I've done. So when I scaled this well, because I had selected the bottom of the well, the origin of my scaling operation was not kind of flush with the well like it was for the FLVER edit. So I've actually... the well has risen up out of the ground a little bit. So you can see that's what we were standing on. Anyway, fixing that I leave as an exercise to the viewer if you would like to. And one last tip, if you are interested in modifying the visuals and the collision simultaneously in Blender, you can select multiple meshes and then hit tab and you can edit them all at once. Like this tree, for example, we could select the high-res submesh, the low-res submesh, and the mesh for the map piece, hit tab, transparent mode. Now, when I drag this around, I'm editing not only the map piece, but both resolutions of collision at the same time as well, which is pretty handy, okay? And we can confirm that if I turn the colors on here. So keep that in mind as well. It helps to load your collision and map piece simultaneously, and depending on how extensive your edits are, you might just want to multi-edit to take care of any simple changes. I'm gonna leave it there, gang, and hopefully that helps you if you were trying to get into asset modeling and you weren't sure how the heck my plugin worked. Sorry it's been so long since the last tutorial. It's been even longer than it has since my last Nightfall update, which is coming soon over on the Dark Souls Nightfall channel as well. As you can see here, the amount of work I've been putting into this reflects the amount of work I've been doing in Dark Souls Nightfall, but more to say on that in that update video. Until then, stay human, and I will talk to you soon.